Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program titled The Ritual of Elizabeth Catlett, a conversation celebrating the opening of the art of Elizabeth Catlett from the collection of Samella Lewis. My name is Jackie Adams. I serve as the Director of Art and Learning here at the Columbia Museum of Art, and I have the pleasure tonight of holding this evening's conversation with a very special friend and a guest, Wendell Brown. But before I tell you a little bit more about Wendell and our guest, I do want to echo those thanks to sponsors that Della did mention at the top of the program. So thank you all. Mm-hmm. Thank you all. It is certainly without your support, we could not bring major exhibitions and programming such as Elizabeth Catlett to the CMA, and we truly appreciate you supporting that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to echo what Michael did in the Crest Talk and thank our curatorial team and our education engagement teams. They have been working very hard behind the scenes, putting the exhibition together, installing it, and also coming up with lots of different programming ideas that you'll see on our website, and that's going to be happening during the run of the exhibition. So with that, tonight I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Wendell Brown. His career has spanned studio practice as a fiber artist. He currently works as an art educator. He's been a gallery manager and currently is. Mm-hmm. And I would argue, I think you're a bit of an art historian as well.
Okay. All right.
He currently serves as an associate professor of studio art at Benedict College, and he is also the director of the Henry Ponder Gallery at Benedict College as well. Wendell Brown has been described as a risk taker in art. I love that. As a practicing fiber artist, Brown's work examines ways African Americans throughout a complicated yet consequential history practices the art of quilt making to prevail over depressed conditions. Brown's mixed media creations incorporate the use of painting, quilting, sculpting, printing, and spirited text. And he's going to show you a little bit about his work very shortly. Brown received his MFA from Howard University and his BFA from Maryland Institute College of Art. He's been in numerous group and solo exhibitions, and while he calls Columbia home, his work, training, and practice have taken him all over the U.S. and internationally to Africa. Previously, he held notable positions as the Director of Museum Education at Hampton University, and you're going to hear a little bit more about how that position comes into Elizabeth Catlett. He was a costume and wardrobe assistant with the Dance Theater in Harlem. And as a studio assistant, he worked with the acclaimed artist Faith Ringgold for a number of years and is good friends with her still to this day. So additionally, and as Della mentioned, Wendell also serves the museum as a CMA commissioner. So quite an accomplished career, and I think you're in for a treat to see how it overlaps with Elizabeth Catlett.
Okay.
So Wendell, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I thought we could begin tonight's conversation to hear a little bit about how your life story put you in the orbit of Elizabeth Catlett. You met her, and you've crossed paths with her. And I thought we could start there and let everyone hear about those experiences.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start first by saying it's funny to always hear people read your bio. Because you're looking like, oh, wow, I want to meet that person. Who is that? I'm like, wow, okay, who is that? Where are they? And then I one other thing, and I couldn't get their names. I was in the lobby downstairs just a few minutes earlier looking at the Catlett show. And someone said, oh, that was Wendell Brown. And then they turned around and they said, I am so interested to hear what you have to say about Catlett. I said, me too. I want to know too. Right. But when I talk about Catlett, one of the first things that it's interesting how I got the mailer in the mail for this exhibition. And I was at the mailbox and I read it and it said Wendell Brown, Catlett. And I was like, wow, But I was interested in how it was phrased because it was phrased as though, Elizabeth Catlett had babysat me or something, But that is not the case, If they had to make a movie of, let's say, Catlett and I, or that whole moment, it would have been A Weekend with Elizabeth Catlett. That's what it would have. That's what the movie would have been, and it would have been a very interesting movie in the sense that. It was and I always say 79. It was not 1979. It was 1997. And it was the opening. I was the director of museum education at Hampton University. And the museum was opening a new museum that moved into a new space. And they were opening the museum with the exhibition of John Biggers' work, who had in the 1940s was a student of Elizabeth Catlett's. And as part of that exhibition, Catlett came to the opening, which in the new museum, her work is exhibited in the Hampton History Gallery, along with many other artists like Charles White and many other artists who are connected to Hampton's history. So Elizabeth Catlett's work was upstairs and John Biggers' work was downstairs. But in going back and talking about meeting Elizabeth Catlett, it was this day, and Elizabeth Catlett had just arrived on campus, and they had tents all over the outside of the museum. And if you haven't been, you need to visit if you ever get to Hampton. It's a place to see. But I remember seeing Catlett, and it was like seeing an angel. It was like seeing God, the goddess, And I was like going to greet her, and I was like, they're going Elizabeth Catlett. Yeah. And I stopped because she was standing there in this kind of a daze type of thing. And she exclaimed, and I give it to her, it was hot, but she exclaimed, "Get me the hell out of here," And I was like, oh my God. And it's interesting because in that moment, she had just arrived. And then she hollers, "Get me the hell out of here!" And everybody, it was almost like the perfect picture to go back and to give you a visual image is a few minutes when this slide changed and it went to a video, and Michael was talking and everybody went running around trying to fix it. That was the Catlett and everybody trying to get a car to get her out and back to the hotel. That was us. We were hopping over things, But that was my initial meeting of Catlett. And it's interesting because in the slide presentation, and that's a whole nother thing, because I really had to edit this conversation because I love talking about Catlett and that whole thing. But I really had to edit, so I just crammed everything into one slide, but I'm still talking about a whole lot of things. But one of the things that was interesting is with that is that in the next slide, not this one, this is Samella Lewis, that's another thing, but the next slide, you will see we'll have a... Can we go to the next slide?
I was going to say, would you like me to? There we go.
The next slide is the day of that event, of that weekend. This is the day after she came back. And I could have been in that picture, but after that, I said, no, I'm not going to get in this picture. But the bottom picture is of that day, of that weekend as well. And that's with John Biggers and William Pajad was another artist in taking that picture. But Catlett is at the top by her work Sharecroppers, which is actually in the show here. So that is actually from that weekend with Catlett, which will be a movie one day sometime. So, but that's but that is from that weekend in working with Catlett. But now I want to go back to that first slide. So we're going to be popping back and forth to talk about the collection as a whole. I started out. Stop me at any point because I'll just keep going. I started off really because this collection downstairs is really talking about Samella Lewis. I wanted to put this one in because I really had not that was about 20 years ago that I was at Hampton. And I really had not gone back and looked at any of this work. So it's almost like going back and open up a suitcase that you've had packed away and, you're looking at it, it's like, wow, I forgot about that. And one of the things with this show some years later, about a year later, we did an exhibition of Samella Lewis's work. And I had this idea to do this children's play, really looking at Samella Lewis's work from the perspective of her childhood. because I'm always fascinated really with looking at an artist's work, but looking at the origin of how they got to that place. And when I got to Hampton, I did a play. I produced a play based on the childhood of Samella Lewis. So I talked to her all the time on the phone. So about the artist text that's here is is extracted from our conversation that talks about her childhood growing up particularly in New Orleans. And then she also talks about going to Hampton. She starts at Dillard University where she meets Elizabeth Catlett. And one of the things that Catlett taught her students at Dillard was she encouraged students at Dillard to collect works by artists, to collect works by her fellow classmates, because she saw value in that. And in doing that, it allowed these students to be able to see themselves and to have ownership of themselves and history and all of those type of things. So over the years, Catlett as well as John Biggers, I do that as well. When I can, I try to buy art. I buy art today. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that over the years, Catlett or Samella Lewis in this right was able to amass such a collection of works. And what we have downstairs is just a fraction of what she actually has in her collection. Mm-hmm. But that is how this work came about, and that's how I got to know pretty much Elizabeth Catlett.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
And holding on to that idea of childhood, going back earlier, that sort of frames up where we're going to go with tonight's talk.
Right.
Because when we were planning this talk, we were trying to think about it in comparison and where you were coming from, your experiences to what you're going to see downstairs, which is later works, the iconic Catlett is kind of what I call this. Mm-hmm. And you pulled up an analogy, a stratigraphic, the stratigraphic effect or the look where you stratigraphy. And it's where, it's a scientific term, but it has the ability to look at layers and these sort of seismic moments in layers. It was a really beautiful analogy. And as we talked about it, we leaned more into going into her formative years, pre-birth, her early years, to really see what made Elizabeth Catlett who she is today and who you see in the show downstairs.
Yes.
So I thought we could talk a little bit about that.
Yes.
And introduce the audience to some of those thoughts that we had.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that we talked, and one of the things that I want to say, if Jackie or Michael Neumeyer ever asked you, hey, let's go out and have lunch and let's just talk. Don't do it. That's how this came about, because we were out talking. We were having lunch down the street. They called and said, "Wendell, you want to hang out with us?" I said, "Sure." And I'm talking. I'm like, yeah. And then afterwards, they called and said, "Hey, you're going to do this talk." I was like, "Oh, okay." But one of the things in looking at Catlett's work particularly not her work, but her life, because the work is an extension of that life. It's a document of the experience. And when I look at Catlett's life, what most amazed me in looking at her life is I kind of look at her life in this terms of stratigraphy. And stratigraphy is this kind of geological term where scientists dig into the earth and they're looking at these settlements. And in looking at these settlements, you're able to see these geological changes. And one of the best ways that I can describe this is when the meteoroid hit the earth and the dinosaurs went extinct. And we can look at these layers and we can say in examining those layers, well, what happened before the extinction? What happened immediately upon impact? And what happened after those periods? And we're able to go back and we can see all of those periods. Now, in examining all of these layers, what happens as well is that we will see also some of those things in the settlement as we examine them that exist throughout those compositions, throughout those components. And for me, that's what made Catlett. And for me, some of those defining years or moment in Catlett's life that I look for, and I kind of edited them for this talk. They say 20 minutes. I kind of edited for this talk, and some of those defining moments for me are called minus 1915. 1915, 1931, 1935, and then we have about 1937, 1940, 41, and naturally 46. And I told, as I was talking to you and Michael some time back, one of the things that I kind of lose that kind of win, and Michael did an excellent job with his exhibition downstairs. Excellent. Because my interest in Catlett's later works, like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 2000s. I'm like, okay, they're nice, this type of thing. But I'm really like the seedlings, the planting of those ideas. Really like to see how she watered those seeds and how they grew and how they nurtured. Because what we have downstairs, pretty much, because there are a lot of the later works, to me, are the fruit. That's the fruit that we can pick off the tree and say, you want one? You're going to want to take one. You want one? That's what that is to me. But to see how they got to that, it's what's most fascinates me. And, when I talk about 1915, what is most amazing to me about that is not the 1915, but particularly for me, it's the minus 1915. Because, and I like science terms. I like watching Nova and on all of those type of things on Saturday morning. And one of the things that I like is that the conversation that they talk about, that Big Bang theory. Well, did time, did life, did anything exist before that moment, before the moment of the Big Bang? In theory, one of the things they used to say was, no, nothing existed before, But when I talk about Catlett's life in that same term or that type of phrase, and I talk about her life, something did exist before Catlett was born. And it's those things that existed before Catlett was born were those things and those stories of her grandparents. Because her grandmother told her stories about slavery. Her grandmother told her stories about slavery, emancipation, Jim Crow, and all these type of things that Catlett ultimately lived in. You know what I'm saying? So these experience of Catlett's grandmother stories about slavery, about the emancipation, and about all of those different type of things were things before she was born, but those experiences were ultimately encoded into her DNA. You see what I'm saying? So when she is born, it's those things. And also one of the things that, when I go back and with my first meeting of Catlett and with the get me the hell out of here type of phrase, for me, that is the motto. It's the motto, the defining motto of her life. And it's that fire that when she is born, it's born into her soul. That get me the out. That is born and is ingrained into that DNA because it was ingrained into her grandparents who were born into slavery. It was in their DNA. And it was in their DNA to the point, particularly with the mother parents, and I'm talking about them on this side, because these were people who were slaves. They were born into slavery. Slavery ended, and what did they do? They sent every one of their children to college. So where does that desire to say that when she is born, it's those experiences that again are embedded into her DNA, are encoded into that DNA that we see throughout her life. And we don't see it just throughout her life, we also see it throughout her work. And when we go downstairs and you see this impact of bold colors and lines and all those type of things, it's there. That's where, for me, that's where it comes from.
Would you like me, Wendell, to moving forward just a little bit, I want to make sure I hit the slides to keep up with your thoughts and everything. So this slide sort of points to, as we come forward a little bit, these, and we're moving into maybe this era of the 1930s, 1940s. Right. You're starting to now see the orbit. Right. You put it so beautifully, the orbit of Catlett. And so each of these pictures shows somebody that was very pivotal and some of the images associated with those people and moments.
Go back to the first one for a sec. That one right there. Go back. The one on the other side is Catlett's work going into Howard. So this is an early work. So if we saw this one, I really like looking at those early works first. Because in those early works, one of the things that happen is you always look at those early works, particularly when an artist, and not just an artist, but anybody, you know what I'm saying? They could be successful in banking. They could be successful in whatever that genre is. But you always look at that end result and you say, well, how did that, go back to those younger years and things that they did, and you try to see those elements that were in those type of settlements or those eras, that was there any evidence of them doing that? And I look at this Catlett work, this early Catlett work, and I kind of say the same thing. So I'm always kind of looking in those works into these elements in that early work and trying to see, well, what is in this work that we ultimately see that's present today? Now we can go back to Howard. So we get to Howard, and she takes that skill that we just saw from that first painting as all students go into college and, this type of thing, and they're doing these type of works in that kind of way. But these are some of the students and some of the professors at Howard in the 1930s who are at Howard and who are influencing and beginning to shape her work. Right. And I just put some down, and many more that's here. And I put some of the works down in the gallery so you can kind of see these influences. One is Miles Jones. Miles Jones was an artist, born in 1905, Boston, Massachusetts. Miles Jones was different because she was from an affluent family. She was from her father was a lawyer and all this kind of stuff. So she grew up, differently. But her works were really incorporated a lot of African traditions, African patterns, textiles, and this type of thing. And I see that influence, and that's why I put this bottom image down that's of Catlett in the show today, because I truly believe that's where that influence of looking at African textile or African tradition patterns and telling the story from those elements really begin to be incorporated into her work. The second one is at the top was another professor at Howard University, and I went to Howard. Another professor at Howard was James A. Porter. James A. Porter, also born in 1905. His father was a minister. But one of the things that as I always talk about these seismic shifts, I think all of these professors are seismic shifts in Catlett's work. And sometimes I not just call them seismic shifts, sometimes I call them undercurrents, because this wave that goes back and forth and it's blending different things. But James A. Porter was a professor who is the professor who introduces Catlett first to muralists, to using murals as a tool for documenting history, for telling stories. And the thing is, with murals in 1935, 1931, 35, is that while we're going at the same time, we have the Harlem Renaissance here in the United States. Simultaneously, in Mexico, we have the Mexican muralist movement at the same time that's happening. So we have artists like Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente, and a host of other artists who are using the mural to document their history, to document all of that information. So James Porter is talking to Catlett about this, and he's introducing this to her. And by the time we get to about 1935, 1934, we have the WPA that's happening here, the Work Progress Administration here in the United States. James A. Porter gets Catlett an opportunity to create a mural in Washington, D.C. as part of the Work Progress Administration program. So this is how she is really introduced to the murals and also the power of creating murals, the power of all of those type of things. And one of the things that happens is she just doesn't confine it to murals. I think and we'll see later because I talk about how she extracts her work from that. And the other artist is an artist that when I graduated, which was not on that, from undergrad, I worked as an educator at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta after I graduated from undergrad in Maryland. And one of the artists that I was fascinated, I had the opportunity to meet. And for this talk, I called the High Museum. This was like 30 years ago. And I called them a couple of weeks ago, but it was 30 years ago when I met him. But I called the Hampton Museum, and I said, and it's funny because 30 years ago they didn't have social media, so when they took photographs, nobody put images up on the website. But I called the Hampton Museum. I said, "Can you find this image with me and James Wells? It's out there." They said, "We will look if we find it." Yeah, nobody had it. But anyway, but one of the things that James Wells did, James Wells taught her printmaking. So her introduction to printmaking came from James Wells. And one of the things James Wells did as a printmaker is he wasn't the first, but he was in that group of artists who were beginning to break form and shape down in his artwork and breaking them down into simple forms. And that's what James Wells did. which heavily influenced really Catlett's work at the same time. And we can see evidence of that in her work today, you know, in how she is incorporating that. So when I look at Howard University in her work, one of the things that I say in this level of looking at this and looking at that whole stratigraphy and looking at that settlement, I said that this area is really putting the ingredients in the pot and beginning to turn the stove on, and you're putting the ingredients in the pot. You know, you're putting some, you know, little Malu Jones, you're putting some James Porter, you're putting some James Wells in that pot, and you say, okay, all right, you got to simmer for a couple of more years, but it'll be ready. You know, and I think that's what's happening, and that's what's happening here in this episode.
I know that we're watching our time and everything, so I might move us a little bit quicker through our slides and everything because these are wonderful. Yes. These are just so wonderful. Right. The content that you pulled together, and these three in particular overlap again in some of these authors. And talk a little bit about what's going on here. Well, and her connections to that work.
Well, this is we expedited a little bit, but fast forward, moving over some of these settlement layers in here. Catlett goes to the University of Iowa, and one of the things that happened she graduates in about 1940, and one of the things that happening here is she gets an opportunity as a teacher. Wow, to work with Grant Wood, who was her teacher. This is a true leaving Howard, going to the University of Iowa and working with Grant Wood. I see that as a real pivot point because one of the things that Grant Wood encourages her to do is paint yours, create your story. Create your story. And I think so often, even as an educator today, you see students trying to mimic me or trying to mimic somebody else or trying to.
And the first time you hear that at that formative age, it's a breath of fresh air.
No, it definitely is. But one of the things as well that I think helped Elizabeth Catlett create her own story is we're talking about the 1930s, the 1940s. I keep saying 1930s and 1940s. Now, we are in Jim Crow era. You know, we're in the Jim Crow era. This is legal laws of segregation here in this country. Can you believe that? That's crazy, right? But her roommate is Margaret Walker. Her roommate is Margaret Walker, the famous novelist. You know, and it's interesting because I have been a fan of Margaret Walker's work for years, and you'll see at the end of this. I've been a fan of hers for years, but this is the first time that I really put Margaret Walker into the context of talking about her work this way. But one of the things that is a defining moment, and I say that the University of Iowa for Catlett was such a pivotal point, is that this sculpture which is lost. So if anybody find it, I'm going to scavenge her for is a sculpture that Catlett made as a student to receive her MFA from the University of Iowa. And it's called Mother and Child. But one of the things that Catlett's grandmother did was told her stories about slavery and told her stories about slavery. Told her about people who used to come over to the house, and she would tell them about stories of slavery. So Mother and Child, to me, is really reminiscent of those stories. But one of the things that is also interesting is that Margaret Walker was her roommate. And and this novel, Jubilee, came out of, it's a novel that was actually published in 1966, but she had been working on it even as a student at the University of Iowa. So it was a long period of time of her being able to research and write this novel.
And this particular novel is going to have quite a influence for you.
No, and for Catlett as well. And for the reason is, Catlett created this novel based on stories that her grandmother told her about being a slave. Her grandmother and her great-grandmother told her about being a slave, you know? So I can only imagine she and Catlett being roommates and telling their stories. And she's telling Catlett about, you know what, my grandmother told me these stories that when she was a slave and blah, 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 and this happened and this happened. Your grandmother said this, my grandmother said this too, blah, 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 blah. You know, and out of that shared experience, Catlett creates Mother and Child based on stories her grandmother told her. And Margaret Walker creates Jubilee, you know? So I find that, I just find that fascinating to tell the story. That's why I have those three in here. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. And I'm anxious because this slide kind of gets it really deeper in the orbit. You're really starting to see some bigger, you're expanding it now. She's now becoming.
Right. In 1943, I'm trying to get right to the point because I have all these eras, but I'm not going to talk about all these eras. I'm going to just combine it. In 1943, Catlett, by 1933, let's put it this way, by 1933, because we're skipping over some things, Catlett she's married by this point, and she's married to the artist Charles White. And Charles White gets we don't have time for that story. But by 1933, at the request of, and there's another artist, but wow, I'm gonna stick to the story. But Catlett, by 1943, Charles White gets a Rosenthal fellowship. And he goes to Hampton to create a mural called The Contribution of the Negro to Democracy in America. And it's still there today. In 1943, Catlett goes with Charles White, and she's teaching art. She's teaching sculpture and ceramics and those type of things at Hampton. But also at Hampton, which I think is a true pivotal point in Catlett's life, her growth, development, because the people that she's able to meet there, she also meets at the same time, which I think is very crucial as part of her talk of being at Hampton, is not just being at Hampton, but also who invited them to come to Hampton to really work on this mural was the educated psychologist Victor Lowenfeld. And Victor Lowenfeld had escaped Nazi persecution. By way, long story short, ends up at Hampton, found the art department at Hampton University, at Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. And now Catlett is there, not just talking about art, but talking about art and psychology with Victor Lowenfeld, and understanding really the mechanisms in art that empowers people, that empowers community. How can we use art as a tool for human development, and all these type of things, which I think that Catlett, leaving away from that, I think she really incorporates that aspect into her work, because unlike some of the other artists, there were artists working at that period who were truly creating art for financial gains. I can make how much? Okay, well, what else you need? Catlett was really creating. Catlett, Samella Lewis, John Biggers are also included in this. They were from an era who were really creating art as a movement. How can we build communities? How can we create art that will show a community who they are, who they can be, who they can become? How can we empower persons in the community and all of those type of things? And I truly believe that her working with Victor Lowenfeld truly transformed her work in ways that we really don't talk about that much in that sense. The other thing, and this will lead to this last space, was while Catlett is at Hampton at the same time, and this is one of the things that I like to do, it was that the painting there was the banjo lesson by Henry Rotana. And that's the one that's in the bottom. It's like the second one at the bottom, the banjo. That's a well-known painting that everybody's seen that painting around in a book or some postcards or something. But Henry Rotana and Booker T. Washington brought that painting to Hampton during commencement ceremony in the 1890s. So that painting has been at Hampton since the 1890s. But and this is one last story, because I know we're winding up here. But one of the things that I want to talk about, and I know it goes into hopefully this next story. But one of the things that I used to do, and this going back to Catlett, that I used to do at Hampton when I was the director of museum education, is I used to go into the gallery at night. And I used to like to wait till midnight. Everybody's gone. And you go into the gallery at midnight, and it's quiet. And the gallery, the 19th century gallery where that painting hangs today, is pretty much lit like this room. So they're pretty much it's lit pretty much on the works. And I would get in my car and I would drive to Hampton. I would go into the gallery, into the 19th century gallery, and I would lay on the middle of the floor. I would lay in the middle of a floor in a room that was pretty much lit like this. And in that room, I would have a conversation with Tanner, But one of the things that we do, or we're taught from birth to listen with our ears, but we have 5 senses. And we have the ability to listen from all of those senses. And in laying in the middle of the floor, I would have conversations with Tanner's work. And what you understood clearly, or what I understood clearly in having a conversation with that work, is the image in that work, the image that we see, that everybody see in that work, that's just what brings us to that painting to look at it. But the conversation that Tanner wants us to hear and to feel and to understand is in the brushstroke. It is. It's in that fine brushstroke. That's where you can hear his frustration. That's when you can hear all of those things that he went through, his parents went through, all of those type of things. It's in those murky brushstrokes and this type of thing. And that takes me to this. This
is where we get to that idea.
We go to this next one and to this ritual. When I look at Catlett's work, and particularly her prints, I apply that same concept to Catlett's prints. Because the conversation is not in that image that brings us to the work. The conversation that Catlett really wants us to hear and to understand is in her cuts. It's in that lino cut. I've never seen anything. It's very intense. It's very intentional. And that's where that message is. That's where she's telling you what to do. That's where she's saying, get me the hell out of here. This is who I am. And one of the things that I say with Catlett's work as well, Catlett was studying with muralists. She was studying with Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente, all of these artists, muralists she was studying with. But Catlett herself was not known to create a mural. That's, when we say, we don't say, oh, look at that Catlett mural. That's not what we know. But what we know of Catlett, and the reason I have this one, and this is funny because Jackie called me earlier, I sent her the slide, and she said, oh, I fixed it. I fixed the slide. I said, no, Jackie, I want that. Kind of obscure, But I wanted to do that because what Jackie does with the Catlett, I'm calling you this with Catlett. What Catlett does with the mural is she doesn't create murals, but she creates sculpture and she frees those images from those murals. She liberates them. She frees them from these paintings, and she makes them separate. So we, as the viewer, become part of it. It becomes a ritual. We become part of that conversation to understand it, to hear what it is she has to say, and in doing that, she's protecting history. She's continuing that whole process,
that dialogue,
that whole dialogue, and in doing that, when you leave, you carry that dialogue with you.
Very nice, Wendell.
Yes.
I thought maybe we could move into and towards the end of this conversation about your work. I mean, I think she was very influential along with this whole orbit that we just talked about in your own practice. So I thought we could take a moment and share with the audience a little bit about what.
Sure. I wanted to tie this one in. Again, I started if somebody would have told me years ago that, well, you know what, you're going to be an artist, you're going to be quilting, you're going to be doing, but I was like, what? What? No. But I started quilting actually as assistant to Faith Ringos. I just had to sit and watch her quilt and do all that type of stuff. And as a result, I started doing them, and now that's what my art form is. But I'm showing this one particularly because of Margaret Walker's work, Margaret Walker's novel, Jubilee. I love that book. I remember reading that book years ago, and it stuck with me. It's still with me today, and then I'm going to have to go back and read it and make some more artwork. But this piece right here is a piece, and I have Swing Low Sweet Chariot, 2003. That was the first one. She talks about Swing Low Sweet Chariot in the book Jubilee. And in 2008, I actually created another quilted piece called Jubilee. So these are two pieces that are inspired and come from based on that book, Jubilee. And I always say, if they do a reprint of that book, I'm going to send this image in, so this could be the cover of it. So if anybody knows that print publishers, tell them they usually know an image. But this is this is based on Margaret Walker's work. So I wanted to really put this image in so you can kind of see that whole relationship of this continued legacy of them teaching. That whole type of thing. Yes.
For the sake of time, I'm going to keep us moving a little bit.
Let's go. Yeah.
make sure everyone can get down to see the show, because I think what you do is you paint a beautiful picture. And if you haven't seen the exhibition, after we hear some of what you've shared with us, you're just you're dying to go see.
Right. Okay.
So this is another one of your works.
This is another one. Again, going back to Catlett sculptures. This is filled of memories and stories told to me. I say told to me. In the same way that Catlett created her works. In the same way that she, now I'm losing my thought, in the same way that she created Mother and Child based on stories told to her. And a lot of Catlett's stories, as well as her prints, were taken from photographs. So they were stories that were told to her that she was inspired to create something else from. This is the same thing that I'm doing here, is creating a series of works that you can kind of navigate in and about and through. And they're filled with photographs and stories and letters and all these type of things that I photocopied and printed and incorporate them into the surfaces.
When we talked about this lecture a long time ago, we had the notion of wanting to do it with an artist.
Yes.
So I'm just so glad you agreed to do it, because I think that your work really exemplifies kind of the influence of what Catlett had on many artists. And this is another one of your works.
Yeah, that's the last one. And this one is Space Between the Words. And this was 2001. And this really goes back again to talking about Tanner. Tanner's work, the image is what brings you to it, but the conversation is in the brushstroke. I'm kind of talking about the same thing here, but these are actually what's between that space. You know, if you can kind of visualize what's between the space, this is what it would look like. And these are still stories and pictures and photographs and stuff as well. So. And and this is just the last quote of Elizabeth Catlett in this expedited journey of Catlett. And she says, I have always wanted my art to serve my people. And that's just a nice quote. And on no note, and on a note.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Wendell, thank you so much. Thank you. We did talk a little bit about just how, just as a final thought, we thought about how relevant her work was now. And I thought maybe if you wanted as a final thought, parting with the audience to touch on that.
I think one of the things in talking about how relevant her work is, and I think that's one of the things when I talk about, I particularly like her earlier works because she's creating them in a time, she's creating them in this frame of resistance against something. You know, she created them against the resistance of being women in the 1930s and the 40s and the 20s. She's creating them against resistance against Jim Crow. But what's so timely and relevant to me that we have a show like that now at the Columbia Museum, because we are now in this new era of resistance.
Right.
So her work now is really in conversation about this time and space where we are right now. And it's another moment of fighting against this resistance and being able to wake up and say, okay, you know, and fighting against those things. So it's almost like a spiral. You know, it continues to go around, and each time it picks up something new. Right. You know, and you're going around, but you're fighting against those.
I always say the artwork doesn't change, but the context of the conversation may change for sure. Right. Wendell, thank you so much. Thank you so much.